Prince William has just detonated the most seismic private decree Windsor Castle has witnessed in a generation, permanently expelling Freddie Parker Bowles, Camilla's own flesh-and-blood grandson, from every corridor, courtyard, and classified chamber of the royal estate. And in doing so, he has ruthlessly redrawn the invisible borders of the House of Windsor, with a precision so calculated, so devastating, that even the most seasoned courtiers are whispering that the future king has finally shed the last vestiges of the gentle prince the world thought it knew. For years, William played the role of the patient heir, the dutiful son, the composed diplomat who swallowed slights and smiled through betrayals, but no longer. Behind the mullioned windows of Windsor's private East Wing, behind doors bolted by hands trembling with the weight of history, William has broken a silent, solemn pact struck years ago at his father's coronation, a pact that promised Camilla's family would remain untouched, unquestioned, undisturbed. That pact is now ash. What exactly did Freddie Parker Bowles whisper into the wrong ears that forced William's hand with such catastrophic finality? Why has Camilla, the queen consort herself, remained chillingly, suffocatingly silent while her own grandson was marched out of Windsor's gates? And what hidden, decades-old prophecy from Princess Anne, sealed in an envelope no one was ever meant to open, finally gave William the courage to obliterate the last illusion of unity within the firm? The library at Windsor was cavernous that morning, hauntingly quiet, the pale October light slanting through the tall leaded windows and long cold columns that fell across the Persian rugs like the bars of a gilded cage. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts, undisturbed, as if the very air within those ancient walls had learned long ago not to move without permission. The mahogany desk at the room's center, the same desk at which George VI had signed wartime dispatches, the same desk at which Elizabeth II had drafted her final Christmas message, bore now a single object, a cream-colored envelope, sealed with crimson wax bearing an unmistakable crest. Not the royal cipher, not the Windsor arms, but the private seal of Princess Anne herself, a stag rampant beneath a slender crown, an emblem so rarely deployed that even the master of the household had reportedly gone pale at the sight of it. Beside the envelope lay a slim manila folder, edges frayed, its contents flagged with red tabs from the Royalty and Specialist Protection Command, the security wing whose reports never ever left the sealed vault beneath the round tower. Yet here they were, splayed open, waiting. William stood at the window with his back to the desk, hands clasped behind him, his shoulders drawn tight beneath the charcoal weight of a bespoke Savile Row suit. When he finally turned, his voice was low, growly, weighted with something that sounded less like anger and more like grief hardening into iron. "For 20 years, he said quietly, addressing not the room but the shadow of a woman none of them could see, the institution has spoken for my mother. For 20 years, they've told the world what she would have wanted, what she would have accepted, what she would have forgiven. Today, I speak for her. And I say, enough." His private secretary, a silver-haired veteran named Sir Edmund Rothwell, stood by the door with a clipboard clutched so tightly his knuckles had bled white, a bead of sweat tracing a slow path down his temple despite the biting chill of the room. Somewhere in the bowels of the castle, an encrypted communications officer was frantically attempting to shut down an outgoing satellite feed that had, inexplicably, begun broadcasting the prince's words to a secure palace archive, a fail-safe William himself had activated only hours earlier. The signal could not be cut, the record could not be erased. Whatever happened next was going into history, unedited. It had begun, William would later reflect, on a crisp evening in late September, when a report had crossed his desk, a report he was never meant to see. Rothwell had brought it in himself, wordlessly, sliding it across the mahogany with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. The document was a transcript. Casual chatter, ostensibly recorded from a private members' club in Mayfair, where Freddie Parker Bowles, 24 years old, sandy-haired, disarmingly charming, and utterly, catastrophically indiscreet, had been holding court over bottles of Krug with a circle of acquaintances that included, quite critically, 2 individuals flagged by MI5 as persons of interest linked to a foreign intelligence stringer network. Freddie hadn't known. Freddie never knew. That was the point. Freddie talked. Freddie laughed. Freddie dropped the location of the Prince of Wales's private security rotation schedule as if it were a piece of gossip about a nightclub queue. Freddie mentioned, in passing, the codename used for Prince George's school transfer route. Freddie joked about the back staircase at Adelaide Cottage and the timing of the household staff shift changes, each detail, on its own, a splinter, together, a dagger. William had read the transcript 3 times in complete silence. Then he had walked to the window, looked out over the frost-covered gardens, and remembered a summer afternoon in August of 1996, 1 year before the world shattered. He had been 14. Diana had taken him to Highgrove, to the walled garden behind the old orangery, and they had sat together on a wrought iron bench while the scent of white gardenias drifted heavy on the summer air. She had been unusually still that day, her hands folded in her lap, her blue eyes fixed on some point far beyond the boxwood hedges. "William, darling," she had said softly, her voice carrying that particular weight it took on when she was speaking not as a mother but as a woman who had learned to read the machinery of the palace as fluently as scripture. "There will come a day when you must decide who belongs and who does not. And when that day comes, my love, you must not flinch. Not for sentiment, not for love, not for the fear of what people will say. The firm is a fortress, William, and a fortress with a rotted stone in its wall is a fortress that will fall." He had laughed, uncomfortable, and asked her what she meant. She had only smiled, that sad, knowing, half-luminous smile, and pressed a small silver charm into his palm. "A swallow. Swallows always know," she had whispered, "when it's time to fly, and when it's time to guard the nest." He had kept that swallow charm for 28 years. It sat, that October morning, in the breast pocket of his suit, warm against the beating of his heart. But it was not only Diana's ghost that walked those corridors. There was another presence, colder, more architectural, a figure that had haunted the periphery of William's life since childhood, whose name appeared on no official roster, and whose face graced no formal photograph. The courtiers called him, when they dared speak of him at all, only by his function, the cabinet advisor. Charcoal suit, polished Oxford shoes that made a rhythmic, deliberate click against marble floors, cold eyes the color of wet slate, a leather portfolio never out of reach. For 4 decades he had been the invisible architect of the institution's most ruthless calculations, the operative who had authored the isolation strategy that had stripped Diana of her staff in 1993, the operative whose fingerprints, William had long suspected, lingered on the decisions that had left his mother alone in a Paris tunnel on the last night of August 1997. He had never been royal, he had never held title, but he had shaped the fate of the Windsors more decisively than any monarch since the abdication crisis, and now, at 73 years old, still slipping through Windsor's back corridors with the same silent authority, he had begun to whisper into Camilla's ear that Freddie's indiscretions were manageable, that the family closes ranks, that the boy simply needs a longer leash and firmer hand. William had heard the whispers, William had marked the man, and William had decided that this was where the line would be drawn. The letter from Anne had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by hand by her equerry in a plain leather satchel, no fanfare, no announcement. William had read it in the pre-dawn hours of a sleepless night, and what he had found within its pages had stopped his breath. Anne, the Princess Royal, the most unsentimental, most iron-spined member of the House of Windsor, the woman who had once told a would-be kidnapper to not bloody likely and meant it, had written to him in her own hand, on plain cream stationery, without preamble. "William," the letter began, "I have watched you these many years with a grandmother's patience and a soldier's assessment. You have earned the right to make the decision I am about to endorse. The Parker Bowles boy is not the disease, he is the symptom. The disease is our willingness, generation after generation, to pretend that blood by marriage entitles blood by conduct. It does not. Your mother understood this. She paid for that understanding. Do not pay the same price by hesitating now." She had signed it, simply, Anne. Beneath her signature, in a smaller hand, she had added a postscript that had made William's eyes sting. She would have been proud, William. She would have been so terribly proud. He had folded the letter, placed it in the drawer of Diana's old writing desk at Anmer Hall, and known, with a clarity that felt almost sacred, exactly what he had to do. The morning of the expulsion was orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. At 7:45, Freddie Parker Bowles was intercepted at the tradesman's entrance to Windsor's East Wing, where he had, with characteristic entitlement, arrived to collect a set of shooting jackets he had left after the last house party. 2 officers from the Royalty and Specialist Protection Command, men whose faces William had personally reviewed, met him with professional courtesy and asked him to accompany them to a small anteroom adjacent to the library. Freddie, apparently amused, had complied. He had not yet begun to understand. He would, within 7 minutes, understand entirely. William entered the anteroom alone. He did not sit. He did not offer Freddie a seat. He stood, hands clasped behind his back in that same position his grandmother had used when she was about to end a career, and he spoke in a voice so low and so terrible that Freddie Parker Bowles, a young man who had never in his life been genuinely afraid of anything, felt the color drain from his face in a single sickening rush. "You have made choices," William said, "that have compromised the safety of my wife, the safety of my children, and the security of this institution. You will not enter these grounds again. You will not attend any function, public or private, at which any member of my immediate family is present. You will surrender the various keys, passes and courtesy credentials that have been extended to you as a matter of familial goodwill. That goodwill is, as of this moment, withdrawn." Freddie had tried to speak. William had raised one hand, a single imperious gesture, and Freddie's voice had died in his throat. "There will be no letter," William continued. "There will be no announcement. There will be no explanation offered to the press. There will be, instead, an understanding, between us, and within the family, that you have chosen to devote your energies to private pursuits. If you deviate from that understanding by so much as a single sentence to a single journalist, the transcript I have read this week will find its way to places that will end, comprehensively and permanently, any future you imagine for yourself. Do we understand one another?" Freddie, ashen, had nodded. He was cornered. The trap had been set weeks earlier, without his knowledge, and every door had already closed behind him. He was escorted to a waiting car at 7:53. By 8 o'clock, Windsor's internal security roster had been updated. His name, quietly, was gone, and Camilla, Queen Consort, matriarch of the Parker Bowles line, the woman whose grandson had just been surgically removed from the beating heart of the monarchy, said nothing. Nothing at all. That silence, William understood, was itself a confession. She had known for weeks, perhaps months, that Freddie's mouth had become a liability that could not be papered over with charm and Krug. The cabinet advisor had briefed her. The cabinet advisor had counseled patience, containment, the gentle rehabilitation of a wayward grandson. And Camilla, torn between the grandmother's love that beat in her chest and the queen consort's understanding of what the firm demanded, had chosen, through her silence, to let William do what she herself could not. It was, in its terrible way, a form of consent. Sir Edmund Rothwell would later observe, in the private notes he kept for the archive, that Her Majesty had received the news of Freddie's expulsion with only a single small nod, and had then requested a cup of Earl Grey, and returned to her correspondence as if nothing had occurred. Nothing, and everything. Across the country, in ways the participants could not yet know, the ripples had already begun. In a pub in Edinburgh, a former royal footman who now worked as a bartender, received a text message from a friend still inside the household, and set down his pint glass with a hand that trembled. In a townhouse in Chelsea, a society columnist, who had been fed a steady diet of Parker Bowles gossip for 3 years, received a curt single-line email from a palace source. That well has run dry, and understood, in an instant, that the landscape of royal reporting had just shifted beneath her feet. In a wood-paneled office in Whitehall, a senior civil servant read a discreet briefing note, exhaled slowly, and thought, "He's going to be a formidable king." 20 million people did not yet know, but they would. They would. The flashback came to William unbidden, standing there in the library after Freddie had gone. The letter from Anne still folded in his breast pocket, the swallow charm warm against his ribs. It was Christmas of 1992, the Annus Horribilis, though he had been too young to grasp the full weight of the phrase, and he had been at Sandringham, 10 years old, unable to sleep. He had crept downstairs in his flannel pajamas, drawn by the low murmur of voices from his grandmother's private sitting room. The door had been ajar. He had seen, through the crack, his mother sitting opposite the Queen, both women lit only by the amber glow of the fire, both women speaking in tones so low and so controlled that the words had barely carried. But he had caught one phrase, spoken by his mother, that had lodged in his memory like a splinter that never worked its way free. "Ma'am," Diana had said, her voice trembling with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief. "The machinery does not protect the family protects the machinery. And one day, one of my boys will understand that. And on that day God help those who have hidden behind us." He had been 10 years old. He had not understood. He understood now. The rotary phone on the corner table rang at 9:17. William turned, and Rothwell, who had been standing by the door for over an hour without moving, picked up the receiver, listened, and then, wordlessly, extended it toward the prince. "Sir, it's your brother." William took the receiver. Harry's voice, when it came through the line, was not the voice of the Duke of Sussex, not the voice of the polished, media-trained prince of the last decade. It was the voice of a 15-year-old boy walking behind a coffin down the mall, stripped of every layer of adulthood by the sheer force of what he had just heard. "Willie," Harry said, and his voice cracked on the diminutive neither of them had used in years, "is it true? Is it really true? Did you actually do it?" William closed his eyes. "It's done, Harold." There was a long silence on the line. Somewhere in California, 6,000 miles away, Harry was breathing, ragged, uneven breaths that carried across the encrypted satellite link with a clarity that felt obscene. She would have, Harry began, and could not finish. William finished for him. She would have done it herself, Hayes, 20 years ago, if they had let her. Another silence. Then, "Thank you, Willie. Thank you." The line went dead. Rothwell, ever tactful, had already turned his face to the window, but the day was not yet done, and the machinery, the ruthless, calculating machinery of the palace apparatus, was not yet finished with its response. At 10 o'clock precisely, the cabinet advisor appeared at the door of the library, unannounced, uninvited, his charcoal suit immaculate, his polished Oxford shoes making that soft, deliberate click William had heard in the corridors of his childhood since he had been old enough to walk. He carried, as he always did, a slim leather portfolio. He inclined his head with the exact measure of deference required by protocol and not 1 millimeter more. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice smooth as chilled cream, "a moment of your time. I fear a small error may have been made this morning. An error which, with respect, might be gently corrected before it hardens into precedent. The Parker Bowles boy is, if I may, a young man of promise whose exuberance—" William held up one hand. The gesture stopped the man mid-sentence with a finality that made Rothwell, watching from the window, feel a shiver of something close to awe travel up his spine. "You will not," William said quietly, "finish that sentence." The cabinet advisor's cold, slate-gray eyes flickered, just once, with something that was not quite surprise and not quite alarm but a distant, unpleasant cousin of both. "Sir, you will not finish that sentence," William repeated, and now his voice had dropped into a register so low, so measured, that the temperature of the room seemed to fall 3 degrees. "I know who you are. I know what you have done. I know the names of the officers whose careers you ended in 1993 because they were loyal to my mother. I know the memoranda you authored in the summer of 1996 recommending that her private security be, quote, streamlined for efficiency, unquote. I have read them and provided them. You have been protected by 4 decades of institutional inertia and by the reluctance of those who came before me to look too closely at the men in the corridors. That protection has now expired." He stepped closer. The cabinet advisor did not step back. He was too experienced, too disciplined for that. But the faintest tremor passed through his hand, and the leather portfolio he had held with such practiced ease seemed suddenly to become heavy. "You will submit your resignation to my private secretary by close of business today. You will not seek employment, consultancy, or advisory role in any capacity connected to this family, this household, or this institution. You will spend the remainder of your life in a silence commensurate with the silence you demanded of my mother. Do we understand one another?" The cabinet advisor stared at him for a long, long moment. And then, at last, he inclined his head, the same measured deference, the same protocol-perfect angle, but this time William saw it, the fractional dip lower than he had ever offered before. "Sir," the man said, and he turned, and he walked out of the library, and the soft, deliberate click of his Oxford shoes receded down the corridor for the last time. Rothwell, at the window, exhaled a breath he had been holding, apparently, for the better part of 40 years. Across the United Kingdom, the machinery of information was beginning, ever so faintly, to hum. A stringer at a Fleet Street desk received a whispered tip and reached for his phone with fingers suddenly clumsy. A political editor at the BBC read a 2-line memo from her deputy, and sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, calculating. A retired duchess in Gloucestershire received a phone call from her goddaughter, and sank slowly onto the edge of her chintz sofa, her free hand pressed against her mouth. In pubs in Edinburgh, in kitchens in Cardiff, in offices in Belfast, in living rooms in Cornwall, the story had not yet broken, but the tremor was traveling through the underground rivers of British society, that vast, invisible network of household staff and courtiers, and old friends, and older enemies. And by nightfall, the tremor would become a wave, and by dawn, the wave would become a reckoning. The nation held its breath, though it did not yet know why. William returned to the mahogany desk. He sat, at last, in the chair his great-grandfather had used to sign wartime dispatches, and he opened the cream envelope with Anne's crimson seal, breaking the wax with a sharp, decisive crack that echoed in the vaulted silence of the library like the report of a small, precise pistol. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a second letter from Anne, longer, more detailed, written in her characteristically economical hand. The second was a photocopy of a document dated the 12th of July, 1996, 1 year and 1 month before Diana's death. It was a memorandum, marked personal and confidential, from the cabinet advisor to a small circle of senior courtiers, and it detailed, in cold, bureaucratic prose, a series of recommendations concerning the ongoing containment of the Princess of Wales's public profile and the strategic reduction of her security footprint. At the bottom of the memorandum, in a different hand, someone had written in the margin, "Approved. Proceed with discretion." William did not need to identify the handwriting. He had seen it his entire life. But it was Anne's letter, Anne's second letter, that broke him. "William," she had written, "your mother came to me in the spring of 1997. She was frightened. She was more frightened than I had ever seen her, and Diana was not a woman who frightened easily. She told me that she had begun to keep records, private records, of the conversations she overheard, of the meetings she was excluded from, of the small, terrible decisions being made about her life by men who had never asked her permission. She gave me one of those records. I have kept it, William, for 27 years, because I did not know to whom I could safely give it. I know now. In the false bottom of the dressing case she left at Kensington, the case you and Harry inherited but never opened, there is a compartment. Inside that compartment is a cassette tape. On that tape your mother speaks. She names the men. She names the dates. She predicts, with a precision that will chill you, the events of the summer of 1997. She predicts, William, the Parker Bowles boys' indiscretions. She predicts, by name, by role, by function, the very man you dismissed from your library an hour ago. She did not just fear him, she named him. She said the words, "One day, one of my sons will see him for what he is, and on that day, the truth will save my boys. You are that son, William. Today is that day. Open the case, listen to your mother, and then do what she asked me, 27 years ago, to help you do." William did not weep. He did not shout. He did not move for a long, long moment. He simply sat, the letter in his hands, and felt 28 years of accumulated grief, restraint, patience and duty rise inside him like a slow, terrible tide. Then he stood, and he walked, alone, to Kensington Palace, to the small storage room on the third floor where his mother's dressing case had sat, unopened, since 1997. And he opened it, and in the false bottom, exactly where Anne had said it would be, sealed inside a plastic sleeve, was a cassette tape. On the label, in Diana's own unmistakable looping handwriting, was a single word, swallow. He carried it back to Windsor. He placed it, with hands that did not tremble because they had passed beyond trembling into a stillness deeper than any composure, into an antique tape player Rothwell had prepared, and he pressed play. Diana's voice filled the library. It was younger than he remembered. Of course it was. She had been 35 when she recorded it, and he was now older than she had been when she died. And it carried that particular blend of hesitancy and steel that had been her singular gift, the voice of a woman who had learned to be afraid without ever learning to be defeated. "If you are listening to this," she began, "then either I am gone, or I have been silenced in some other way that has made this recording necessary. My name is Diana. I am the mother of William and Harry, and I want to speak, while I still can, about the men who have decided that my life is a problem to be managed." She spoke for 47 minutes. She named the cabinet advisor by his real name, his title, his function. She described 3 separate meetings she had overheard, one of them accidentally, 2 of them because a loyal footman had held a door ajar. She detailed the specific security modifications that had been imposed on her in 1996 against her explicit written objections. She predicted, with the calm, mathematical precision of a woman who had learned to read her captors as fluently as a chess master reads a board, that one of the younger members of the Parker Bowles family would eventually become a liability the institution would attempt to manage rather than address, and that on the day her elder son finally refused to accept that management, the truth of who has really been running this family will begin at last to come apart. And then, at the very end, her voice softened, and she spoke directly to William. "My darling boy, if you are hearing this, then you have done what I could not. You have looked at the machinery and refused to bow to it. You have loved this family enough to protect it from itself. I want you to know, William, that I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you, and I am with you, my darling. I am with you in every corridor of that fortress. I am with you every time you refuse to flinch. Be brave, my swallow. Be brave, and know that when you finally speak for me, you have my voice, my blessing, and my everlasting love." The tape clicked off. William sat in the silence for a very long time. Rothwell, standing by the door, was weeping openly, silently, without shame, tears tracing slow paths down the lined dignity of his old courtier's face. The pale October light had shifted, now, and the long columns of gold that had bisected the Persian rugs at dawn had softened into the deep amber of late afternoon. Somewhere in the castle, A grandfather clock chimed the hour, and the sound carried through the ancient stones like a benediction. At 6 o'clock, Buckingham Palace released a brief, formal statement noting that Mr. Frederick Parker Bowles would henceforth be pursuing private commercial interests and would not be attending future royal events in any capacity. The statement was 17 words long. It said nothing and everything. Fleet Street erupted within minutes. 20 million people watched, refreshed, whispered, speculated. In pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses paused mid-air. In studios in London, presenters stumbled over their teleprompters. In a townhouse in Chelsea, a society columnist who had known the family for 40 years poured herself a very large gin and, for the first time in her career, decided she would not write a single word about it. Some stories, she understood, were not hers to tell. At 7 o'clock, a second, unannounced statement was released, not from Buckingham Palace but from Clarence House. It was 2 sentences long. It read, "Her Majesty the Queen Consort supports the Prince of Wales in all decisions concerning the safeguarding of the royal family. Her Majesty considers the matter closed." Camilla, in her silence, had spoken at last. It was not an endorsement of love. It was not a repudiation of blood. It was something rarer, and in its way more powerful. The acknowledgement of a queen consort that the future king had the right, and the authority, and the necessity, to draw the lines she herself could not. At 8 o'clock, William walked alone through the frost-covered gardens of Windsor, the swallow charm in his pocket, the cassette tape sealed once more in its plastic sleeve, the letter from Anne folded against his heart. He walked to the small chapel where his grandmother lay, and he stood there in the darkening evening, and he spoke, not aloud, but in the private cathedral of his own grief and his own love, to the mother he had lost and the grandmother who had trained him and the aunt who had at last given him the key. "It's done," he told them. "The rot has been cut out. The fortress will hold, and she is finally at rest." 9 o'clock, Harry called again. This time neither brother spoke for a long moment. They simply breathed together, 6,000 miles apart, 2 boys who had walked behind a coffin and become, at last, the men their mother had always known they would be. "Come home, Hayes," William said quietly. "Come home when you're ready. There's a chair at the table with your name on it. There always has been." "I will, Willie," Harry said. "I will." The line went dead. This time neither of them wept. At 10 o'clock, in a small flat in Pimlico that had been paid for through channels no one had ever bothered to trace, the cabinet advisor sat at his kitchen table, staring at a resignation letter he had already signed. He was 73 years old. He had shaped the destiny of a monarchy for 4 decades. He had never expected, never, in all his calculations, in all his machinery, in all his careful and ruthless management of the machinery of a family, that the boy would grow into a man who would look him in the eye and know him for what he was. He folded the letter. He placed it in an envelope. He addressed it, in his own careful, precise hand, to Sir Edmund Rothwell. And then he sat, alone, in the amber lamplight, and he understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be the one who was cornered. The broadcast, the encrypted, unerasable satellite feed that William had activated at dawn, the fail-safe that would ensure this day was recorded in the deepest archive of the Windsor institution for as long as the institution endured, cut, finally, to black at 10:17 in the evening. No music, no commentary, no closing statement. Only, in the silence, the faintest sound, so faint that only the archival microphones would catch it, of a single tear falling onto a mahogany desk in a library at Windsor Castle, and of a young king in waiting whispering, at last, into the great and listening dark, "The swallow has flown free, mummy. The swallow has finally flown free. The truth had saved her boys. The secret was out." And across the sleeping nation, in the vast, breathing hush of an October night, 20 million people who had not yet understood what they had witnessed began, in the depths of their own unconscious, to understand that something in the House of Windsor had shifted, permanently, irrevocably, and forever, and that the reign of the next king had, in every way that mattered, already quietly begun.